On EMED, and I hope we will enjoy your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ricard. Thank you, the colleague from Great Team, and for EMED for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and to try to address this topic, which, as Ricard said, has been discussed amply and it continues to be at the center of our political and public debate. So what I'm trying to do is, rather than adding a further layer, what I try to do is to deconstruct some of the political and public discourse around the so-called refugee crisis and try to show the complexities and nuances that the term crisis can potentially highlight in terms of the actors involved, and the policy responses, but also what kind of these responses have and on the migrants and refugees themselves. What I'm going to do is to refer the research on which this paper is based was carried out between 2015 and 2016 and involved quite extensive field work in Italy, Greece, Turkey, and Malta. And I'll tell you in a bit more in a second. But what I'll try to do, so first of all, is to establish the crisis. So what the construction of the crisis, but then move on from the construction to try to deconstruct the idea of crisis. So most of the time you will see that the word crisis end up in inverted commas. There are many inverted commas in this talk, I'm afraid. So I'm not doing like this all the time because otherwise it looks a bit silly on the video. But then what I try to focus is where this different construction of crisis come from, who is producing them, for what purpose, and try to think about what does it mean crisis in terms how it's possible that the term crisis takes so many different meanings at the same time, how people can find a way of working around these terms, even if each of them seems to put a different significance into that. And I will look at three examples in particular. One is around the role of IOM and the UNHCR. The second one is about, in particular, the role of Frontex and the asylum and border industry. And the third one is about Europol and children in particular. And then we try to look at why is this important, why we need to pay attention to the construction of crisis, what are the real-life implications of this different understanding of the refugee crisis and the migrant crisis and migration crisis. And final, some conclusions. So the research I worked on was funded by the ESRC, which is the Economic and Social Research Council of the United Kingdom, and DFID, which is the Department for International Development, and involved a consortium of three British universities, University of Birmingham, University of Coventry, and University of Oxford, and partner university and organization in each of the countries where we did our research. We worked in Greece, Malta, Turkey, and Italy. And we collected about 500 interviews with refugees and migrants who had reached Europe in 2015, and 100 interviews with stakeholders in these countries. What we tried to do is, and then maybe we can talk later about the methodology, was to capture, not to sample, because it was impossible to sample, because the flow was extremely dynamic, and for reasons that I'm not going to explain today, but basically there was a significant difference between the people that were reaching the European coast and the people that were staying in those countries. So it was very hard to sample in terms of representation, but we tried to do it as much as possible. As well. And in terms of the interviews with stakeholders, what we tried to capture was the multi-level governance of the crisis. So we went from speaking to ministers, to local authorities, but also to activists, volunteers, churches, and other actors involved. So it involved various actors that were involved in helping refugees and migrants. Here you get a sense of where the interviews were carried out and where people were coming from. So this is a map where the red dot indicates where we did the interviews, and the blue dot indicates the place of origin of the people we interviewed. So as you can see, we interviewed, and we did it, the place of origin is down to the level of the city, it's not the state. So what we try to do is to collect data about all the places where people transit through, and then, because I guess in order to understand the journeys, it was really important not just to say that people went from Pakistan to Iran, but also to understand which city and village they went through. So you get a sense of, so we did about 215 interviews in Italy, about 250 in Greece, and then the rest were between Malta and Turkey. So when we talk about this, the crisis, I wanted just to capture a few sort of headlines. Since 2014, we had about 1.6 million arrivals on the coast, the southern coast of the European Union by sea. So what we call those also irregular sea crossings. And about over 12,000 people died crossing the sea, the Mediterranean Sea. The year that was by far the most significant in terms of this arrival was 2015, when we carried out the research. In 1 year alone, we had over 1 million people that reached Europe, with 845,000 moving from Turkey into Greece, mostly through the island of Lesbos, Leros, etc., and 153,000 reached Italy, mostly from Libya, but also through from Egypt in a smaller number. Okay. So these are the headlines, one that probably everyone is more or less familiar with. But another aspect which is really interesting and important in the crisis is the significant increase of children that came through the crisis. This graph shows the number of asylum applications lodged by unaccompanied minors. So you can see between 2008 and 2015, the data for 2016 have not been released yet. We had a significant increase in the number of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, WASC, that went from about 20,000 on average until 2013 to about 100,000 in 2015. So you can see basically you have almost a 5 times increase in 2015 compared to the past years. Okay. However, what I'm trying to do now we start this process of deconstruction. Let's get closer to the data. So we had those headlines, but then if you start to look at more closely to the arrival in Greece and Turkey, things get a bit more complicated. So first point, the first element which is interesting is the magnitude of the route. So while in Greece you have about 850,000, in Italy you have 150. So it's about 5 times more people reached Greece than reached Italy. The second element that is significantly different is the country of origin of the people that reached the Italian and Greek shores. So while in Greece you have the first 5 nationalities alone covering about the 96% of the arrival. So basically you have 56% of Syrians, about 24% of Afghani, 10% of Iraqi, 3% of Pakistani, and 3% of Iranian. And then you have 4% of others. If you look at the Italian side of the story, the first 5 nationalities only cover about about just above the 50%, like 59%. So the first lesson here is that you got a much more diversity in terms of country of origin in Italy than in Greece. You have about 18 nationalities that have more than 1%, represent more than 1% of the arrival in the Italian side. But the other element is also that there is almost no overlap. So the people that came from Greece are not the people that came through Italy. And this is really important because when they closed the route between Turkey and Greece, there was a lot of this talk, especially from the media, that people were starting to move on the other side. So the idea was that now the Syrians, they're not allowed anymore to cross into Greece through the sea. They will go to Libya. No, that didn't happen. Didn't happen in 2016. It's not happening now. And there are reasons for that we can discuss, but it didn't happen. So there are one crisis, or there are more than one. There are 2 crises, or even more. Is this a Syrian refugee crisis, or is something else? I mean, if you look at from the perspective of Italy, you only have 5% of arrival from Syria in 2015, even less in 2016. Okay. A closer understanding of what's going on has implication clearly for policy, both in terms of managing the arrival stage, but also in terms of managing the integration process. Because one thing is about planning support and integration strategies for people that come from civil wars, and everyone speaking the same language, or mostly the same language. Another thing is to deal with the much more variety of country of origin, or migration histories, experiences of persecution in some cases, languages, etc., etc. So you need to think differently in terms of policy. But now, let's even get closer. So we said that there was a 5-fold increase in the number of the unaccompanied minors. But then, if you start to look instead at this broader European number, and then you start to look at by country, then things get different. So you can see that a country like Sweden, the red line, in between 2014 and 2015, had a massive increase in the number of unaccompanied minors. In many ways, in 2015, Sweden alone received more unaccompanied minors than the rest of Europe in 2 years, in the past years. So in the sense, 40,000 people, almost 40,000 people applied for asylum in Sweden that were unaccompanied minors. But then the green line, this is England, this is the UK. The UK, where there's been a lot of talk about this refugee crisis, the moral panic of the refugee crisis is the same that in most European countries, but they haven't seen anyone. They haven't seen a crisis. There are no refugees that reach the UK. Nothing more than what you normally see. So in a sense, in terms actually, in absolute numbers, there were more unaccompanied minors in UK in 2008 than in 2015. Okay? So it's quite an interesting thing to think about in terms of the implication. But there is even a bigger story here. That when we talk about this very large number of children, unaccompanied children, that's true, clearly. But actually, they are a minority of the children that moved into Europe through the refugee crisis. But why we don't talk about the other children is something that we really should ask ourselves, and we should ask to policymakers. Why the children that are not unaccompanied are invisible in the public discourse is quite important to think about. And here you get a closer representation of the case of the UK. And you can actually observe that in 2008, the United Kingdom was receiving about 38% of the overall number of unaccompanied minor applications. And this went down to about 5% in 2015. So when they talk about, it's quite important. Basically, even if you look from the perspective of the United Kingdom, and there is an obsession with the camp of Calais. So Calais is in the news every other day. But maybe provocatively, sometimes I say you just need to send a ferry boat to Calais. You can put all the people that are in Calais and move them to Britain. You just need 2 boats, and you solve the problem. So the point is that the representation of the crisis and the reality of the crisis not necessarily go together. But this basic distance, it tells us that there is something we need to interpret, understand, and theorize. Another interesting aspect of the narrative, the dominant narrative around this refugee or migration crisis, is around whose crisis it is. I mean, what we tried to do with our interviews, this 500 interviews, was to map the different trajectories that people had taken to reach into Europe. One thing which we found particularly interesting is that it's overall people had crossed about 57 countries in order to get into Europe, cumulatively, obviously. And the people coming through the East Mediterranean route, that is the one from Turkey to Greece, we encountered 26 different routes, that is basically trajectories that people took. In the case of the Central Mediterranean route, we got 68, which in a way reflect also the larger diversity in terms of the country of origin that I mentioned before. And within this sort of variety of routes, we identify a number of important, I don't know if you can see the map, unfortunately it doesn't seem to be very clear. A number of key points of transit at stopovers. So if you think, which are already known in the literature, like Agadez, in particular in Niger, is a crucial point of transit, or the border area of Algeria is also one other of the key point of transit. The analysis got even more interesting if I think in terms of the duration of these journeys. So there is a larger number of geographical routes, but there is a significant difference in terms of the duration of these journeys. What we found out was that while the people traveling through the Eastern Mediterranean route, so mostly those 5 nationalities I mentioned before, the Syrians, the Iranian, Iraqi, Pakistani, and Afghani, you got most people that had reached destination within 6 months, between 1 and 6 months. They reached into Greece. This is not the case for people in Italy. So the red bar basically indicates that about less than 30 people of the one they interviewed arrived into Italy in 1 to 6 months. The other significant difference is that the people that traveled to Italy took much larger number, was between 7 and 18 months time, which means that basically people were mostly stopping over. And they had a different way of accumulating the capital for doing the journey. So while a lot of the Syrians had all the money they needed to get into Greece, the majority of the people we interviewed that came through the Central Mediterranean route had to stop in bits by bits, leg by leg, work, get the money, enough money, find a person there that could take them to the next step and do the next movement. However, there is also a third group that I think is interesting to bear in mind, which is the people that basically had took more than 18 months and up to over 10 years. But in this case, and this theoretically raises interesting issues, is are we still talking about a journey? In this case, probably the word journey is not correct, or you need to use it with inverted commas here. You know, someone who takes 10 years to reach into Greece, it means basically that was not a journey. It's a person that has probably set up a family in Khartoum or in Tripoli or elsewhere along that in that area. And at some point, because of the circumstances, were forced to remigrate, and in some cases they were redisplaced. So, for example, the case we interviewed some Palestinians that they had to move again. So they were Palestinian refugees that they had to move again into Europe. We interviewed a lot of Afghani people that had to move from Iran, where they had been living for most of their life because of the attacks on minorities, because of the dire circumstances, livelihoods, opportunities, because the exclusion from the job market, etc., etc. So there is another different story there. That is a story of remigration and redisplacement, secondary displacement. In terms of another key indicator, so we saw before the data, the 12,000 people that died crossing the Mediterranean as a cumulative number. The thing is actually that it's really important to disaggregate it by routes, because there is massive difference between the number of people that traveled from Turkey to Greece and from Libya to Italy, and the number of people that died across this route. So, for example, in 2015, while you have about 85% of the people that reached Europe came through the Eastern Mediterranean route, so from Turkey to Greece, but then you have almost 80% instead of those who died came through Libya to Italy. So what are the motivations for this? There are multiple reasons. So in other terms, you can say that one person over every 1,049 died crossing from Turkey to Greece, from Greece to Turkey, and one person every 54 died crossing from Libya to Italy. So the point here is that the mortality rate, the dangerousness of the route varies significantly. Now, the obvious reason, that is the one that Frontex always mentions, is the weather condition and the distance. Clearly, there is a significant difference between navigating 600 kilometers and 10 kilometers, which is the distance between Lesbos and the coast of Turkey, and the one from the departure point in Libya and reaching Sicily, or 300 kilometers to reach Lampedusa. So there is a significant difference there. However, I don't know if we've got time later, but if you compare the data only for Greece between 2014, 2015, 2016, there is some interesting things coming out in terms of the mortality rates there, which cannot be attributed to geographical or weather condition. So the point here is that we need to denaturalize this crisis. We need to think about, we were talking about the refugee crisis in 2014 when about 200,000 people reached into Europe. We were talking about a refugee crisis in 2015 when there was about over 1 million people came into Italy and Greece. And now we're still talking about the refugee crisis when the number went down to about 300,000. So how big is a crisis is something we need to think about. What makes something a crisis is the other question we need to ask. And certainly you could say that if you look from the perspective of Greece, between 2014 and 2015, they witnessed the increase between 43,000 and about 800,000. That's a significant increase in number of arrivals. But in the case of Italy, between 2014 and 2015, actually you have a decrease in the number of arrivals from 170,000 to 153,000. But still the narrative is there. So we need to think about what basically underpins this narrative. And the way that I interpreted it is that there is the crisis is used to tell different stories. You can use the term of a floating signifier, and I'll tell you later what does it mean. So there is a humanitarian crisis, there is a refugee crisis, a border crisis, and a security crisis. This is just to mention the main one. Then there is many other crises we have heard about: solidarity crisis, political crisis, etc., etc. But for example, in this case of in 2013, the first time we talked about the refugee crisis, it was very much a response to the shipwreck offshore in Lampedusa when people died at sea. At that point, the crisis was that we could not allow people to die at sea. So there was a moral, ethical, political obligation for Europe to save people at sea. So that was the crisis. There was no mention of the refugees at that point. The refugee crisis really emerged as the dominant narrative with the arrival of the Syrians in large numbers. But then we have the crisis applied to other contexts, particularly the border crisis that was captured in those images of the people crossing into Hungary when Hungary started to build the wall. Yes, the wall, we've seen wall much before Donald Trump. They were built, the Mexican wall was built by George W. Bush, started long ago. So Europe built walls, and one of them was this famous Hungarian one that many European leaders condemned at that point. And then they start to build walls between Greece and Macedonia, between Slovenia and Croatia, between Austria and Slovenia, and between France and the UK. Interestingly enough, it looks like that some of these walls, they all look the same. They are built with Italian mechanical technologies, which enables you to build walls very quickly. So basically, you can put the pylons down at a very high speed. And this is something that is interesting, not as much because of the company that does this, but it's because the fact that there is clearly money circulating with building walls, and the cost of the Mexican wall is huge. So there is clearly a border technology industry that benefit for some of this that we're talking about. So there seems to be different understanding, and the point which is interesting, I guess, here is how all these different meanings can live together. So the crisis, the way that I'm looking at crisis, as I said, is a floating signifier, which may mean different things to different people, and whose meaning, because it's relational and not as an essential category, can be negotiated and changed over time. So the point, I guess, which is important here is that the crisis is in a constant process of redefinition or reappropriation. The point is who define and who appropriate. So who are the actors involved here and what for? So these are the key questions I think that we need to reflect when we engage in working on the refugee crisis. And this, the reference to the power knowledge is very much linked to Michel Foucault's understanding of the production of knowledge as part of the exercise of power rather than as separate process. And one of the two technique or manifestation of this power knowledge, I think we can link to the idea. The first one is the so-called politics of naming, so the issues of the name. So very often we have heard people talking about the refugee crisis in inverted comma, the migrant crisis, the migration crisis, the refugee migration crisis. So the difficulties, the challenges in finding a way of defining this crisis is actually really important, because it highlights something that is there, and is the fact that it is not just because we don't know exactly who is traveling, is that each definition is underpinned by different political agenda and different actors that in a way mobilize on this understanding of crisis. It's interesting that, for example, and this oscillation, this pendulum, has been going on for quite some time, so since at least 2013 in a very clear way. So, for example, the researcher from the University of Sheffield noticed by doing a study on the photo of Alan Kurdi, the 3-year-old child, and she observed that he was visualized more than 20 million times in 12 hours since it was published. But what she observed was that the discussion around the photos was very much linked, associated to a change also in the way that we were talking about the migration. So the shift from migration to refugee linked to the crisis. We also know that partly in response to the photo and all the sympathy and that was generated around it, that was what in a way caused also the shift of policy in Germany around the so-called open door policy, and that then generated the very much opening up of the Balkan routes. A less known event that was happening more or less around the photo, which people sometimes forget, is that this is when Russia started bombing in Syria. This is more or less the same exact time, September 2015, where the Russia started systematically bombing the cities where the opposition to Assad regime was. And there is some interesting work being done, which is something that unfortunately people that work on refugee studies don't do, is around the use of refugees as a weapon of war. what is called the weaponization of refugees, which is something we need to bear in mind when we talk about the refugees. Because if you only work with the very bottom end of the crisis, with the refugees that tell you about how they had to escape, you miss the point about what role do they serve vis-a-vis a broader geopolitical project, which is the one of the stabilizing maybe the European Union. But that is not the only story around here. What I found interesting was that during this time, the production of knowledge on the crisis became central in the way that different agencies, international agencies, national agencies, position themselves and put themselves forward as involved. What you see is that especially the largest international organizations start to invest on their research department. So they get in-house researchers to produce research. They start to collect in a daily bulletin the number of people that arrive, the number of people that die, for example. So there is very much, also in terms of the commission research, they start to commission consultants to produce piece of research, research councils, and start to create special grants for producing research on the refugee crisis, as indicate the one that I've been working on. So it's really interesting, the research politics, in a sense, underpinning and linking up, and the role that it plays in this crisis. One thing that is interesting is to think about what does this mean. I mean, in a sense, I'll look more in the three cases later, but this is an email exchange that I had last week with a very senior practitioner working for a large international organization. She said, there is a debate within our operational centers about the relevance of the existing legal framework, refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, to define our clients' protection and assistance needs, and our priorities in terms of public communication and advocacy. Some would like us to prioritize refugees over migrants in our positioning, based on the fact that they are clearly defined rights to enter and stay, and that they flee from their life. There is also recognition that the rights to seek asylum is shrinking, and that we should actively defend it as a humanitarian imperative. So you can see, actually, there are very direct implications about this issue, about how do we name or how do we call the crisis, what it is. And which implications do that produce what they call effects of reality. They have a real-life impact on the refugees and migrants and their opportunities and challenges. And I will look at the end of some of these implications. But before moving on, I want to give you these three examples of this relationship between the production of knowledge of the crisis and the actors involved and the agenda that this mobilizes. So the first example, I think, comes from the two most important international agencies involved in providing support for the refugees and migrants during the last few years. One is the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and the other one is IOM, the International Organization for Migration. One initial element to notice is that the UNHCR has very much been campaigning and pushing for a definition of the refugee crisis as a global refugee crisis. What they always point out in all their documents is that what we see is a record number of refugees and internally displaced people in 2015, a number that is the largest we have ever recorded since the Second World War. And they also point out to the fact that most of the refugees always live outside the European Union. So the 86% of the refugees and displaced people lives in the developing country. On the other hand, you have IOM that has two main sort of assets, discursive assets. One is about this is a migration crisis rather than a refugee crisis. You will see much more commonly defined in the papers and documents. But the other element is they become their specialization is that the Mediterranean is the deadliest sea in the world. And they produced a very interesting report called Fatal Journeys that now they upgrade each year. And they also have a website where on a daily basis they record the number of estimated dead or dispersed or the dead migrants. What is interesting here is that calling the Mediterranean the deadliest sea is methodologically extremely problematic. The problem is, there is a very interesting thing. So look at this chart. This is on the report. Unfortunately, you cannot see very well. So he points out that in 2016, and this you will find, the website is called missingpeople.iom, something like that. You can find it on Google very easily. This is basically showing which are the most deadly sea. So here, the blue one is the Mediterranean. Then you have Europe border, the Middle East as the third one, North Africa, Horn of Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, US, Mexico, etc., etc. So what do you think is the problem with this one? The problem is that there is no other place, no other border in the world which has got the same level of control that the Mediterranean at the moment. Is the number of, the Mediterranean has got basically the NATO boats, you got most of Europe, you got Frontex, you got a drone system. Everyone that basically jump in the water in the Mediterranean can be counted. Let's put this in. All the other places, the border, the land border are by definition very difficult to monitor. The actual point of undocumented migration is that actually is undetected. So now we got used in the last 2 years of think that the people that are detected are illegal migrants. But the problem, the thing about undocumented migration or illegal crossings is that actually was very hard to detect. So it's very interesting how this message still came out very strongly, and you got the graph there. So it's how do you produce the knowledge? What kind of message are you serving is important. So what do they get out of it? And this is an oversimplification, but it's interesting to observe for everyone who has been looking at the history of IOM, is that for many years they have tried to become part of the UN families, and finally in September 2016 they managed. So in the UN Refugee and Migrant Summit in New York, the IOM was incorporated in the UN family. So it's changed its status. Before, IOM was in an intergovernmental organization essentially. What is why the UNHCR is somehow promoting a global refugee agenda? One thing is clearly is the issue of funding. What we're seeing at the moment is a lot of the major donors of the UNHCR diverting funding from Africa and Asia towards Europe. So basically they are diverting funding that normally goes to support people living in camps, which are the majority of the refugees, towards the European emergency, which is a problem from an organization like UNHCR, also is a problem from all the other refugees that are in camps. But it's also interesting how, in this sort of a definitional issue, is that, so the one on top is a screenshot from the UNHCR website where they basically have upgrade on a daily basis the data about the Mediterranean crisis. So they've been doing it since 2014. And it's very good for information because basically they got officers on the border town, they collect data from they collect data from the various national authorities. So one element in the top, I don't know if I got a light here. Do I have a light? Let's see. Okay. Down here, this is the interesting bit I want to point out. This, so the UNHCR stressed the fact that 86% of the people that arrive in Greece from Turkey come from the top 10 refugee-producing countries. That's very important. And we said because it's Syria, it's Iraq, etc., Afghanistan. This is a shortcut in a way to say that they are deserving people and they need to be protected. The problem is that on the same website, if you click on the Italy tab, which is the one here, they will tell you that only 32% or sometimes 26% of the people arriving into Italy are from the top 10 refugee-producing countries. So the same discourse that within the context of Greece is there to help refugees because it makes a case for them to be deserving of help, is basically completely backfire if you look from the perspective of Italy, because it's undermining the claims of the people that get into Italy, because it basically get told, oh, everyone who crosses through the central Mediterranean are illegal migrants. It's a very important thing to observe because this is producing a number of consequences we'll see later. The second example I want to give is of Frontex and the so-called the Border and Industrial Complex. And there is interesting work by Ruben Anderson and Rhys Jones that came out in the last few years around the role of money and business in the management of migration. It's interesting to point out that between 2005 and I guess this is 2016, the budget of Frontex increased from 6 million to 176 million. If you look at the number of people they employ has increased more or less in the same sort of proportion, and they basically have managed in the last few months to become the European Border Agency. So not only playing a role of supporting the national border, but basically we have seen Europeanization of border control as part of the crisis, which is a very important shift. we also have seen, as I mentioned before, that there is clearly a lot of research, especially from the US-Mexico border, point out the effect that the privatization of migration governance is producing in terms of getting new actors involved in the business that is produced, and the interest that a lot of these actors have in fostering a narrative of crisis continues. So here I got a couple of samples which I think are interesting. So the one on top, this one, is from an article that came out in 2015, but we have seen the same article in 2016 as well, in which the current director of Frontex, Leggeri, is been coming out with this statement saying that there were 1 million people on Libyan shore just waiting to come into Europe. You read the article, go to report, and you will see that there is actually no evidence of this. You can also argue, and this is a way of looking at this, that in 2015 and even 2016, the border between Libya and Italy was a fluid border. So basically, they had all the search and rescue operation at sea. If you were jumping in the water, people would just pick you up, essentially. So in a sense, even at the time where the border was basically open, the largest number of people that crossed through there was 170,000. So where does 1 million come from is actually an interesting issue. It comes from the fact that through the lens of the European authorities, every person that is doesn't hold a Libyan passport is a migrant, and is a migrant on its way or her way to Europe. So the assumption is every migrant in Libya is actually coming into Europe, which is false, because everyone who knows the history a bit of Libya migration knows that Libya was, especially during the Gaddafi, when he shifted his policy from a pan-Islamic to a pan-African migration policy, was about inviting migrant workers from sub-Saharan Africa to work in Libya, and often they were working for European company, etc. So Libya was an immigration hub, also because it was by far much richer than the rest of the neighboring countries. So the point is that these people, and a lot of people we interviewed for the research, are still living with this idea that Libya is a place where they want to go to work because they don't believe in that the civil war has got such a spread. And then basically they end up moving into Europe because they realize that there is no livelihood and there is a lot of racism, and they end up in these terrible warehouses, and the instances of violence that we encounter in the research are massive. The second example from Frontex is from this one below. Is an article that I wrote for the conversation, I think in October 2015, and in which basically I was pointing out how Frontex systematically produce quarterly report which update on the number of people that crossed into Europe. So this is a report in which they're nicely designed. It goes to all the media, is press release. And basically they say there is 1 million people that crossed into Europe illegally. So that's what they say all the time. So what happened was that I sort of challenged, they always tweet about these things. So because I do a lot of tweeting, so I went there and I sent a tweet to Frontex and I said, do you think you may be double counting? And someone replied on the other side, said, yes, we do. And actually, we may even triple count. So this is what they replied in a tweet. So what I did, I basically just took a screenshot because I assumed they were going to delete it. And I wrote an article for the conversation and observing how Frontex systematically, basically, they are just doping the numbers. They are just increasing the numbers. And what they do is very easy. What they do, they basically mixed up the number of people that cross external European borders, the number of crossing with the number of people. So just to give you an example, you cross from Turkey into Greece, this one, illegal crossing. Then you live in Greece, you go to Macedonia, no one counted when you leave. But then you get into Slovenia, or you get into Croatia through Serbia, or you get into Hungary, that's 2. So I become 2 people. Then Hungary pushed me back, and I go to Slovenia, I'm 3. So what's happening is that basically they trouble count without any problem. And what is as a result of this article, they basically issued a clarification on the press release, which is this one down here you cannot read, and it says, Frontex provides monthly data on the number of people detected at the external borders of the European Union. Irregular border crossing may be attempted by the same person several times in different locations at the external border. This means that a large number of the people who were counted when they arrived in Greece are again counted when they entered the European Union the second times in Hungary or Croatia. So what they do now is they continue to issue this bulletin every month or every quarter, and still they have, every time, they still count as they were counting it before, but they have always this disclaimer at the bottom. I think it's quite paradoxical. So basically, they're neutralizing me from writing another article, but still they continue this game. So the interesting element here, I want to point out about this, it's not just about doubling the funding of Frontex, but it's also this idea that we see an increasing role for private actors within through the narrative of the crisis and the border control. Building borders, it costs a lot, especially the smart borders. Drones that are used for patrolling cost a lot. Reopening the borders because Schengen is suspended costs quite a lot of money, and normally, often, what has happened is been outsourced to a company like G4S, because basically states don't really have any more border policemen that can be mobilized to open a border. What is interesting on this is that once this process are started, they basically tend to self-reproduce themselves. This is research has been pointed out in particular in relation to the role of the private providers in the managing of immigration control and detention in the US. And this is something that we need to be aware of, in a sense, because in a way, the fact they are promoting and pushing with this narrative of the crisis helped also to reproduce the need for their jobs, essentially. So it's self-sustaining. Now, the final example is about refugee migrant children, essentially. So in the case I want to discuss briefly is about something that Europol, so in January 2016, Europol, which is the inter-police agency of the European Union, came out with a sort of long interview that was published in The Observer, then reproduced in a number of countries, saying that there were about 10,000 unaccompanied child refugees that had disappeared in Europe. And they were mostly, basically, an army of potential and real modern slave or victim of sexual exploitation, a victim of trafficking. So this was a big number. The number immediately attracted attention, and it was circulated. So what I tried to do, I mean, a few weeks later, Europol got funded a very major project to fight against traffickers of unaccompanied minors, which was quite interesting, at the timing of the interview following the opening up of the agency. But it's okay. What I did, though, is interesting. I start to work about this number because I do work on unaccompanied minors. I was quite interested to see where the 10,000 were coming out. And again, it's an issue, a strange issue, that the missing children are often a case of double counting. So these are 5,000 of them. 50% of these children are registered in Italy when they arrive. Then after a few days, they disappear from the Italian protection system for children, and they end up either in Sweden or in Germany, essentially. The way the data are collated by European agency is done on a national basis. So each country will report a number that then is aggregated together. So double number are not cancelled, because these people are not counted as name, but counted as number on the heads. So it's about 500 people arrived in Italy, 500 people arrived in Germany. There is no way for them to know that 400 of those people were actually the same people that disappeared from Italy. What is, though, more interesting, perhaps? So I wrote an article about this, published a report for IOM that was published in the data analysis bulletin, but still, you see that the number is still there. It didn't move out. It was also in a parliamentary debate recently, and it was used by children advocates to advocate for example, the UK government to do more with children. So this is an important point we need to reflect. So a number that was pushed there, not necessarily with solid evidence-based behind, start to be picked up by other actors with other agendas, in this case, children's rights activists. So, and the role of research is sort of in the middle, because you don't want to upset the children's rights people, and you don't want to, obviously, you want to help the child refugees. On the other end, you also need to reflect on how these numbers circulate. From conversation with a number of NGOs, as part of the research, often there was a reference to what is called killer numbers. In particular, it is something that used by, I don't know if any of you is an NGO fundraiser, but it's actually quite something we use very often. It's the fact that in order to raise funding for an NGO, you need those big numbers, round and powerful, that they can communicate a lot. numbers that they have a life of their own in many ways. And it also was useful for pushing for transferring children, migrant children from Calais into the UK. And what is it? This is an example of a convergence on narrative. So not just each actor has got their own agenda. Here you've got the same number, the same knowledge produced, they serve as different interests somehow. And what does this number do? What is my problem with the number, in case this is a bit of a footnote, is the fact that by shifting the blame on the traffic, it shifts completely the blame on the visibility on the trafficker. So he's saying that these children disappear because they're victim of trafficking. What it does is completely absolving the responsibility of the state as producing some of these vulnerabilities. And some of the vulnerabilities are the fact that, for example, both Germany and Sweden are increasingly the number of deportation of Afghani young people, which are the largest component of this group. So what happened is there is people that disappear at the beginning. So the one that disappear in Italy is because they want to go, they are 16, 15, 17, and they want to go to Sweden, which has got a better welfare protection system, and they give them chance to go to school, etc., etc. So there is one reason for disappearing is that Italian rights are quite weak in terms of protecting children. Second reason, though, is that countries like Sweden and Germany now are increasing deportation. So what you have is that they got the disappearance of older unaccompanied minors. So you got a group of people that tend to disappear when they are 17 and off, or very close to becoming 18. So there are different reasons for disappear. And some of them, they may be more, end up as trafficked or having to rely on the services of the trafficker. But part of this is actually linked also to other forms of vulnerability. So it's in a way, it's a result of other reasons that that kind of narrative obscure. Now, why this matters? And I don't know how I'm doing with time, because I've lost completely. I tend to talk a lot about these things. I mean, there's so many subscript narratives. So different crisis drones or different data for validation. So that's one element I think is important. They also tend to identify different hierarchies of deservingness. So the idea is they tend to identify different kind of groups that seems to be more deserving than other in terms of protection. So this is what I mentioned before about the people that sort of at risk of dying at sea versus the people that escape from Syria. So is it the Syrian families that are the one that everyone wants to host? I mean, probably you have heard all these stories about all the refugee welcome movement, very much. Everyone was expecting a Syrian families, and then everyone got upset where there were not enough Syrian families because there was a lot of single male coming in. And so they didn't know what to do with them. So it's quite interesting how there is very much a construction. Who do we think that deserve more our help? Which informs a lot of the motivation of the actor involved. And what we saw, especially in 2015, before the implementation of the Greece-Turkey deal, was the fact that there was gradually a shift towards an interest vis-a-vis towards saving the people at sea. So from an interest from the Central Mediterranean route towards an interest towards helping the Syrian refugees. So the Syrian refugee became, by definition, the good refugee. And increasingly, that same narrative, and this is the point I made about UNHCR using the top 10 refugee countries, they tend to identify the others as less deserving, less legitimate. However, this less deserving group is not just the so-called economic migrants coming from the Central Mediterranean. The same narrative also has undermined the very definition of the refugees that is enshrined in the Geneva Convention. Because one of the key points of that definition is that basically you can be recognized as a refugee if you have a well-founded fear of persecution. It's not because of your country of origin. Actually, your point was that you are recognized as a refugee for individual reasons that you can prove. It's done on purpose. And so what we're seeing now that basically partly linked to this fact that the refugees from Syria are being given a better treatment, you have other groups that are treated much worse. And this is particularly true. I'll mention later on in the case of Italy. So the two kind of and it's also in a way contradicts some of the findings from our research, because we found out that the very large majority of the people we interviewed, a significant majority, especially like over 88% of the people in Greece and 66% in Italy, very much refer to causes that you can link to forced migration as the reason for migration. And they had sophisticated, nuanced way, and I'll invite you to look at the report we wrote, Destination Europe, with a question mark, to see that basically the interplay between economic and forced reason for migration, forced migration reason for migration. You know, very often, in some cases, people refer to the impossibility to get enough food for their family. So it's poverty. But then you realize that part of the poverty is because the person comes from an ethnic minority that is not given access to job market, or because they come from a sexual minority, or because there is a sort of civil war within the country, so they end up to be in the wrong political group. So there is an interplay there that we try to unpack in the research. So let's look at the... and in a way, what is interesting is sort of trying to create a binary distinction between refugees and illegal, that actually they are much more linked than we imagine. So one obvious point is, in order to claim asylum within Europe, you have to travel illegally. There are almost no legal route to apply for asylum. This is something we have heard a lot of times, but it's actually quite interesting when people talk about, oh, these are illegal migrants. Yes, they travel illegally, but because there is no possibility. This doesn't undermine their claim for asylum, and this is actually something that is written in the Geneva Convention, that people should not be penalized by the means of transport they take to reach a place where they claim asylum. So one. But there is also the opposite process going on, which is basically the movement from refugees to illegals, which is what is happening, for example, which is linked to the precarization of the rights and entitlement which are given to people that are deserving of protection. So, for example, the increased use of temporary protection, subsidiary protection, humanitarian protection, etc. Or, for example, the fact that increasingly a number of EU states are making the rights for family reunion, are shrinking the rights for family reunion. So you have, in case people are forced to get their wife or elder member of families to travel to join them illegally. I mean, there is a process that partly is due to a change of legislation, which is happening after the refugee crisis, not before. So just to give you two examples why this matters, the importance of this label. So as we said before, most people die crossing from Libya to Italy, while the large part arrives for Greece. However, if you look, for example, compare 2015 and 2016, especially the first 3 months of 2016, before the Turkey-Greece deal was implemented, what you notice is that along the same route, you got a very significant difference in the number that people died. So from 1 person every 1,000, we went down to 1 person every 500. So the same route became it became much more dangerous. We also observe, if you look at the case of so this one, if we look at the case of the Central Mediterranean route, that between 2014, 2015, and 2016, the death rate over the first 5 months of the year, and this is because it works well in terms of when the specific policy started, and also because during the winter month, the NGOs don't put the boat at sea. So like MSF or MOAS, that are the privately owned rescue boat, only come in the late spring at sea. So these are the months in which the search and rescue operations are handled by the Frontex and the European boat vessels mostly. So what you see is that in 2014, which it was during the Mare Nostrum operation that was run by Italy, you have less than 1% of the people that died in those period of time. The following year, Mare Nostrum was replaced by Triton, and you have 3.75% of people that died along the route. And the 2016, which is during the Operation Sophia, this get even worse with 4.3%. So what is happening here is actually a significant difference in the resources that are put at sea for doing search and rescue. And there's a significant difference in what is the theater of intervention. So what we are seeing now, and this is something that is in the news even 2 weeks ago when there was the Malta summit, is that increasingly the European Union is investing in training the Libyan coastal guards to do search and rescue operation in Libyan territorial waters. So what we're seeing is that the rescue line, the line of rescue, is gone back towards the European Union. And this is producing more people dying. The other issue with the good refugee versus the others, you can see within the context of Italy as well. So Italy traditionally tends to have a better success rate for country coming from West Africa than the rest of the EU. So you are more likely to be recognized some kind of status if you come from Gambia, Nigeria, Senegal, if you are in Italy than in most other European states. However, since September 2015, which is what we notice is that there's a shift on narrative, which is when Angela Merkel, opened the door to the Syrian refugees. What's happened that the opening of the door on one side is the closing the door on the other. And what is happening on the ground at that point was that you got deployment of the European asylum officers in Sicily a lot, and basically acting as they want to standardize the responses to various group applications across the country. So, but the idea is that basically the Italian adjudicator are put under pressure by the European agency. It's also the time when the hotspot system is introduced in more substantive way. So the hotspot system is the centralized system that was managed through European funding, and basically changed a bit the way that the Italian system was operating at that point. One of the key consequences of the hotspot was that the European Union wanted more people to be fingerprinted and identified on arrival, rather than what Italy was doing at the time. But what is interesting here, that from that point, what you have is a significant increase in the denial, the rejection of asylum application. You got a decline in the subsidiary and humanitarian protection over the same time, and you got a decline in the refugee status granted. So it's quite interesting, is the time when the European Union was in a way Europeanizing the crisis, and an idea of the good refugees as the Syrian refugees was basically emerging with justice. You see actually also in terms of the adjudication of the asylum cases, Italy started to change the way that it was approaching the asylum cases. Okay, I think. Yeah, I just got, but it doesn't go. Yeah, I think. Okay, I'll move to the conclusion. Okay. The other one was basically showing what is happening as a result of this change in the decision making. No, let's see, 2 minutes, I can do it. So as a result of this Europeanization of the crisis and the hotspot system, what you have many more rejection. But what is happening is that actually the number of forced removal is not necessarily increased, because there are no bilateral agreement with a number of countries, which means that Italy cannot do the deportation. It also means that forcibly removing people costs a lot of money, and there are not these resources available. So the point is that this shift in the decision making is actually producing an increase in the illegal migrants within the context of Italy, which is interesting because Italy tends to give some forms of right of protection for a period of time, with the idea that people then can move into more stable, regularizing their position. At the moment, as a result of this shift, is that you have basically an increase in rejection and an increase in people that basically live without documents in the country, because they are not allowed neither to work nor to move out of Italy. So just to conclude, I think it's important to denaturalize the crisis, because in a way offers us an entry point into understand the crisis as a field of contestation of different agendas and interests, but also with different actors which have an interest in producing a narrative of the crisis. Yeah. And the idea of crisis is ambiguous, but at the same time there are alliances that seems to emerge in some circumstances. Within this context, the production of the knowledge production is central for legitimating specific understanding and meaning of the crisis. And this is partly why we've seen agencies investing in significant resources into this production of knowledge about the situation. But also see the crisis, so as I said before, as a kind of a floating signifier, where a different actor can put different meanings and negotiate it around them. But it also helps us to put a spotlight on the figure of the refugees and how it's changing, and how it's changed throughout the course of the crisis. What kind of implication it has in terms of the everyday experience of people, in terms of number of people that die at sea, but also decision maker on their asylum application. So, and in a way, question the boundaries between legality and illegality that is constructed as a very rigid boundaries in the narrative that the European Union and European member states do around the refugee and migration crisis. And final point is that, so in a sense, by doing this, we can highlight what we call effects of reality that current politics of the surveillance produce in particular in relation of search and rescue operation and death rates at sea, but also on the growth of the European undocumented population. Thank you.